I'm Ariana Scott, and this is The Goddess Recordings, an independent documentary series from Signal Found Productions and the Trans Wiki Project. The Goddess Recordings examines the life, digital emergence, and cultural legacy of Raquel Reyes, an early trans figure whose online presence helped shape one of the internet's first models of self-authored identity. In our first episode, we explored the life that came before the web, the childhood, the instability, and the early acts of survival and self-invention that shaped the woman long before her image ever travelled through wires. Episode 1 asked a simple question: who was the woman before the online legend began to take shape? Episode 2 asks a different one: what happens when a woman like that meets the early internet? At that moment in time, the web was still unmapped territory, slow, unstable, largely unregulated, and not yet fully understood. There were no platforms, no algorithms, no verification. There were only message boards, personal websites, and early chat rooms. For trans users in particular, the internet was not a luxury. It was a refuge, a laboratory, a rehearsal space for lives that could not yet be safely lived offline. This was the environment Raquel Reyes encountered, as she stood at the edge of her own transformation, not just of body or name, but of identity, as something that could now be transmitted to the world. According to Reyes's memoir, Goddess, the idea of building a website was not originally her own. She entered into a partnership with a former lover who brought the idea to her as both a creative and financial proposal, an offer to invest in images, hosting, and early promotion. It was not framed as a cultural experiment. It was framed as opportunity. When Raquel first entered the digital world, she was not thinking about legacy or influence. She was thinking about visibility, about money, and about reaching beyond the geographical limits that had shaped every part of her life up to that point. Raquel's rise was not immediate, and it was not effortless. In the late 1990s, building a website, particularly one with a paywall, was still technically demanding and financially risky. This was a period before template builders, before automated hosting, before passive income models. Everything had to be constructed by hand. Just as critical as the infrastructure, however, was the question of content. What would be shown? What would be withheld? And what, precisely, people would be willing to pay for. At that time, trans women, especially young, conventionally beautiful trans women, were still widely framed as a rarity within both mainstream media and online adult spaces. That perception shaped early demand, and it shaped early expectations. Before the site launched, before the images circulated, there was a deliberate process of deciding how Raquel would be presented to the world. Through her investment partner, Raquel was introduced to photographer John Benson, a visionary for the time who had helped launch the early online careers of several of the medium's first cisgender women, including former Playboy playmates exploring second acts on the web. Accustomed to producing images of high visual polish, Benson brought the same technical precision to his work with Reyes, while allowing a raw, unscripted energy to surface, an element that distinguished her sharply from the amateur photographs of trans women then beginning to circulate in early online forums. According to an early online interview, Raquel later estimated that nearly $20,000 had been spent before the website ever went live. Adjusted for today, that investment, covering infrastructure, hosting, photography, image processing, content creation and maintenance, would be roughly equivalent to $40,000. For Raquel and her partner, this was not a trivial outlay. It reflected both ambition and risk, building systems, producing material, and carrying overhead without any guarantee that a paying audience would emerge. More than anything, it underscores the labor behind the launch. This was not simply a matter of uploading photographs. It required planning, technical execution, the construction of an access system, and the careful presentation of a product, all within a digital economy that was still learning how and whether it could accommodate a woman like Raquel Reyes. The moniker she chose for her URL, the TS Goddess, emerged not from branding strategy, but from proximity and observation. John Benson's wife, a former Penthouse pet and early internet star in her own right, would often refer to Raquel as the goddess. It was a word used casually at first, descriptive rather than promotional. Over time, however, it began to function as a kind of shorthand for how Raquel was perceived within their small creative circle, striking, commanding, and unusually self-possessed. When the site was named, the phrase remained, not as a slogan, but as an identifier that had already taken hold. When the TS Goddess website officially launched in the first months of 1999, it was remarkably sophisticated for its time. The site featured a structured layout, professional image galleries, tiered access through a password-protected paywall, and regularly updated content, elements that were still uncommon outside of corporate media or major adult entertainment studios. Navigation was deliberate. Pages loaded with comparative speed for the era. Images were carefully sized, presented in coherent sets, and arranged to emphasize continuity rather than randomness. This was not a casual personal page. It was a fully realized commercial platform, built with the expectation of sustained traffic and repeat visitors. At a moment when much of the web was still experimental and informal, the TS Goddess stood out as a polished, intentionally designed destination, positioned less like a diary and more like a digital publication. In 1999, discovery on the web worked very differently than it does now. There were no social media platforms to drive traffic, no recommendation algorithms, and no automated promotion. Visibility depended on links, listings, and word of mouth. The TS Goddess began to circulate through a combination of early search engines, print media, adult directories, and cross-linking from other personal sites. Banner exchanges and referral links were common at the time, and sites often grew their audiences by sending users back and forth across a shared network of pages. Word traveled quickly in niche online communities. Forum posts, private message threads, and email lists played a significant role in directing early users to new destinations. Links were shared discreetly, sometimes privately, sometimes in public boards that disappeared as often as they were created. For many early visitors to Raquel's website, discovery felt informal, almost accidental. A link at the bottom of another page, a recommendation in a forum thread, a URL passed along in conversation. But the effect was cumulative. Traffic built gradually, then steadily. And as more users arrived, the site's presence began to extend beyond its original point of entry. The earliest subscribers arrived almost immediately, but technical issues were constantly being managed behind the scenes. Payment systems on the early web were still unreliable and often cumbersome. Transactions sometimes failed. Accounts had to be set up manually. Passwords were issued and reissued. Customer service, such as it was, existed at the margins of personal email inboxes. Each new subscriber represented more than traffic. It represented confirmation that the model could work, that people were willing not only to look, but to pay. For Raquel, this marked a shift. What began as an experiment now had measurable consequence. The site was no longer hypothetical. It was operational. The response to the content was immediate and highly specific. Visitors did not simply comment on beauty or novelty. They responded to presentation, the quality of the images, the coherence of the sets, the sense of authorship behind the site. Unlike many trans representations circulating at the time, often fragmented, anonymous, or framed through voyeuristic lenses, the TS Goddess presented consistency, a point of view, a controlled visual identity. This distinction shaped how the site was discussed. It was not merely passed along as a curiosity. It was bookmarked, revisited, and tracked for updates. In the earliest years of the Internet, chat rooms functioned as informal gathering spaces where the curious exchanged stories, questions, and desire in real time. There was no separation between creator and audience. Interaction was direct and unfiltered. Raquel became a regular presence in those rooms. She spoke to visitors directly, answering questions, acknowledging attention, and quietly directing interested users back to her website. This was not automated promotion. It was personal visibility, conducted conversation by conversation. Slowly, as word spread across these networks, her URL began to circulate with increasing frequency. Links were shared in messages and passed from user to user. What followed resembled what we would now call viral behavior. Images moving rapidly through informal networks before the language for such circulation even existed. No single post caused it. No central platform drove it. The spread was organic, cumulative, and largely uncontrollable. By the beginning of 2000, the infrastructure was in place. The audience had formed. The signal was live. What had begun as a carefully constructed site was now moving far beyond its point of origin, into servers, mirror sites, and private collections Raquel would never see and could not fully control. In our next episode, we will follow what happens when visibility begins to accelerate faster than ownership, when a digital persona starts to circulate independently of the person who created it. We will also examine a byproduct of that visibility, a form of commodified intimacy that emerged alongside her growing online presence. This was not framed as conventional sex work, but as carefully arranged, one-on-one encounters with admirers who paid, often generously, for access to her time, her attention, and her physical presence. What began as online visibility was now producing real-world contact, bringing new practical considerations around access, boundaries, and expectation. I'm Ariana Scott, and this is The Goddess Recordings, an independent documentary series from Signal Found Productions and the Trans Wiki Project.